Welcome to the Venezuelanalysis podcast. I'm your host, José Luis Granados Ceja. The Venezuelanalysis podcast brings you independent, on-the-ground, English-language coverage of Venezuela and the Bolivarian process. You'll hear news and in-depth analysis about the country, as well as coverage of leftist and grassroots forces. And on this month's show, I am once again joined by fellow staff writer over at Venezuelanalysis, Andreína Chávez, and we're going to be talking about the renewed threats by the United States against Venezuela with the mobilization of troops and weaponry and ships into Latin America, specifically the Caribbean region, that is very much being interpreted as a direct threat to the Nicolás Maduro government in Venezuela. But of course, there's always more to the story when it comes to U.S. intervention in Latin America, and we're here to unpack that all. But before we begin, Andreína, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Hi, José Luis, and thank you for having me. And again, I love coming to the podcast. It's always so strange to have to talk about these horrifying threats that Venezuela is always facing. Every single month, every single year, there's something new that we are trying to survive from the United States.
All right, so I think we should begin here with this story from earlier this month, where we started seeing more noise when it comes to Venezuela and the imperialist ambitions of the United States government with the Donald Trump regime in the White House, where we saw what I think at the beginning was kind of a laughable move by the United States government, where they increased the bounty on Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro from 25 to 50 million, for information leading to his arrest. We were very familiar with kind of these dynamics of putting bounties on certain important, notorious figures, but here we see it applied to the realm of international relations. And of course, it's worth remembering that this actually isn't the first time that this bounty has been increased. It was actually increased under Biden and initially placed on Maduro's head back in Trump's first government. And obviously, I think the reaction by the Venezuelan government should come as a surprise to no one, saying that they condemn these accusations as baseless efforts to, of course, further these regime change narratives. And the reason why I did not treat it with the kind of seriousness, perhaps, that other people did. There was a lot of noise on social media, like, is this a precursor to another regime change operation? Is, of course, because of this headline from earlier, from July 24th here, where the Trump administration actually reversed course and allowed the restart of Chevron operations in Venezuela. So it's kind of a curious situation where, on the one hand, they say, okay, U.S. companies can once again operate inside Venezuela, and then a few weeks later saying that Maduro is the head of a cartel that they invented called the Cartel of the Suns, or Cartel de los Soles, and they have to do something about him, and then, making a lot of noise trying to suggest that he is a criminal actor and therefore needs to be brought to justice. So my first question for you, Andreína, now that we have this basis, what do you make of this mixed messaging that we're getting from the United States when it comes to policy towards Venezuela? You have, on the one hand, an expansion of U.S. operations by Chevron in Venezuela, and on the other, this aggression, this increasing of the bounty to 50 million that is trying to criminalize the Venezuelan president.
Well, first, let me tell you, you were not absolutely wrong when you first laughed when they announced the 50 million bounty on Maduro. Many people in Venezuela were saying, oh, I know where Maduro is. He's right there in Miraflores, so he's visiting this barrio in this place in Caracas or any other part of the country. So it was laughable at first. But then we saw how this began to escalate into what we now see that is a full military threat against Venezuela. And I think the contradiction between this aggression that Venezuela is facing, the bounty on Maduro, the deployment of U.S. troops in the Caribbean, while at the same time allowing Chevron to restart operations in Venezuela, I think is very on brand with the President Trump administration. He doesn't actually do things to favor the U.S. people, to favor to favor anyone that is not himself and his own party and his own political project and what he wants to achieve. So he's doing this because Chevron is a U.S. corporation and he's looking after the benefits of this huge corporation. And at the same time, he's also continuing to be aggressive against Venezuela because he's trying to to please two sides of his government. The one side, the one that is led by Marco Rubio, that wants Venezuela to be overthrown, the Venezuelan government to be overthrown, that wants more aggression against Venezuela. And on the other side, there's this other more moderate part of his government, the one that is led by the Chevron, who is lobbying his government, the one that is led by Grenell, the advisor that is coming to Venezuela that negotiates with Maduro. And so he's trying to just do both things. But at the end of the day, it is a strategy that seems contradictory. It seems like it doesn't lead anywhere, but it is very on brand for Trump. He doesn't do anything that doesn't benefit him and his own political project, his own MAGA party. So that said, I do want to talk a lot more about this whole new phase of aggression that Venezuela is facing. As we know, the U.S. is sending troops to the Caribbean, exactly right at the coastline of Venezuela, and under the pretext that they're going to be fighting drug cartels that the U.S. alleges are being operated by the Venezuelan government. And this is, of course, a direct threat to Venezuela's sovereignty, and this is a dangerous situation for the entire Latin American and Caribbean region. I think we need to analyze what is happening in sectors. By that, I mean that we need to, before talking about the military threat, we need to talk about how the U.S. is fabricating this false narrative against Venezuela in order to manufacture some sort of consent, to manufacture a pretext that so people will accept any kind of aggression that happens in Venezuela. So on August 7, U.S. Attorney General Pamela Bondi accused President Nicolás Maduro and several other high-ranking Venezuelan officials of working with transnational cartels. She specifically mentioned the Mexican Sinaloa cartel and two criminal enterprises that don't actually exist. That is, the so-called Cartel de los Soles and the Tren de Aragua gang. Both of these organizations were very recently designated foreign terrorist organization in the United States. According to Pamela Bondi, the Venezuelan government either collaborates or is leading these criminal enterprises with the purported aim of bringing drugs and violence to the United States. On top of that, Washington has also raised the bounty on Maduro, as you said, from 25 million to 50 million for information leading to his arrest or conviction. Just yesterday, I was watching an interview from Terry Cole, the DEA chief or director. He was saying that President Maduro is also working with Colombian guerrillas, such as FARC and the National Liberation Army. I mean, at this point, you could say that Maduro is leading every single criminal organization that exists in the entire world. And have they provided any evidence for all of these accusations? They have not. They haven't provided anything.
It sounds like he's the ultimate criminal mastermind by the way that the United States paints the picture.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if I was Maduro, why would I bother being president of a country if I can lead all of these amazing criminal organizations and be ruling almost the entire world? I mean, it is very ridiculous when you look at it that way. But of course, they don't care about that. They don't care about the fact that it sounds ridiculous, that it sounds completely made up, because what they want is just to simply to overwhelm the population, overwhelm the public with all of this information. So nobody knows, nobody can distinguish what is true, what is false, what is a half true. I mean, that's the point. The point is to confuse people to the point where if an invasion happens in Venezuela, if a mercenary incursion happens, if the Maduro government is overthrown, if Maduro is assassinated, somehow people can accept it because they have all of this information that was thrown out there about how Maduro was this huge criminal leader. So I want to look at the two organizations the two main organizations that Maduro is being accused of being the leader. That is Cartel de los Soles, or Cartel of the Suns in English, which is a narrative that I was reading about it just now, and it is something that began in 2015, which is the same year that Obama declared Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. That is not a coincidence. That didn't happen by coincidence. I think that's when you realize that this is a well-planned criminalizing narrative that it was born in 2015, and it has been growing and growing and growing until what we're seeing right now. Something that amazes me and that I wonder why nobody else asked themselves, if this is such a large drug trafficking organization, how come we don't know of any infrastructure, of any networks, of any specific drug seizures that are related, that are specifically linked to Cartel de los Soles? Like, for such a large organization, it is amazing that it leaves absolutely no traces. Like, there's absolutely nothing that can show that it actually exists. And that is the whole point. Cartel de los Soles, we don't have any evidence that actually proves that it exists. And on the other side, we have Tren de Aragua. We have been hearing about Tren de Aragua for months now. And the US first mentioned Tren de Aragua back in February, and they designated it a foreign terrorist organization. They did this with the purpose of being able to criminalize Venezuelan migrants that are living in the United States so they can detain them and then expel them. We saw these 252 Venezuelan men that were sent to El Salvador's Secot prison, where they were tortured, they were abused, and they were finally rescued very recently in July by the Maduro government. So Tren de Aragua had that. That was the intention of creating this narrative that Tren de Aragua was a transnational criminal organization led by Maduro. Of course, even the U.S. intelligence itself, they have revealed in a declassified memo back in April that the United States government never had any kind of proof that Tren de Aragua existed beyond the Venezuelan borders, or that it had any presence in the U.S., or that it had any links to the Maduro government. So as you can see, it is once again another organization that more importantly, Tren de Aragua existed. It was a prison-born gun, and then it was dismantled in 2023, and it never went beyond in a specific region in northern Venezuela. Like that's where it operated. That's what it did all of his criminal operations, and then it was dismantled, and that was it. That was the end of it. Of course, we know that some criminal organizations, sometimes they go beyond borders, but we don't have any proof that Tren de Aragua actually evolved enough, or it had enough members to be able to become a transnational criminal organization.
I think it's very much what a term we use in English, a boogeyman. It's a fabrication, it's an invention, it's part of intelligence operations in order to drive home a narrative. I think anybody who's even remotely familiar with the dynamics of migration, with organized crime groups that do interact with migrants as they make their journey throughout the Americas, understands that it has been dramatically overstated, the actual, if any, power that the so-called Tren de Aragua actually has. And I think, like you have correctly pointed out, it's far more a response to the interest of trying to demonize the Maduro government in Venezuela.
For sure. I mean, and even the 252 men that was sent to Secot, even investigations done by U.S. media and U.S. organizations, even those organizations also proved that these men did not belong to any gang, to any criminal gang, that it was all a fabrication, that they were innocent. So we know that it's not just the Maduro government saying that Tren de Aragua doesn't exist, it's that there are several independent investigations that back this claim, that Tren de Aragua doesn't really exist. And then lastly, another accusation against Maduro is the whole collaboration with the Sinaloa Mexican cartel. And even President Claudia Sheinbaum, she said that her government doesn't have any evidence that Caracas has any ties with the Sinaloa cartel. And she even sort of demanded in the US, if you have any evidence, then show it. I mean, show it to me. And of course, that's when you realize that they know this is a lie, and they know that it can be quickly dismantled, but they don't care. They don't care how ridiculous it sounds. Another part of the narrative against President Maduro and the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan people, because I keep saying that they're demonizing and criminalizing President Maduro and the Venezuelan government, but at the same time, they're also criminalizing the entire Venezuelan people, because they also have said that every Venezuelan migrant somehow is related to Tren de Aragua, and it all comes to this conclusion that somehow an entire country is being criminalized. So another one of the narrative that is being used is that they confiscated like $700 million in assets that belong to Maduro. And then we were doing an investigation in VA trying to figure out, okay, where are these all of these alleged assets that Maduro has in all across the world. And then we realized that it was completely ghost assets. They don't exist. I mean, it is mostly things that the United States doesn't have any kind of public information, public records, legal documentation, property records, anything that proves that Maduro was, or anyone from the Venezuelan government has ever owned any of these mansions and vehicles and cash and all of these things that they say they owned. We even realized, we were looking into it very recently, and we realized that they said that they confiscated 2 planes that belonged to the Maduro government. And then we realized that these are 2 planes that the US stole from Venezuela. 2 Venezuelan state planes that were used for official trips that were stolen by the US in 2024 and 2025. They were stationed in Dominican Republic, with the complicity of the Dominican Republic government. These 2 planes were stolen from us. And even more than that, there's a 3rd plane that was also stolen from Venezuela last year. And it was a plane that it was even used to transport medicine, to transport food to Venezuela. So it was kind of a really important asset for the Venezuelan people to have. And it was also stolen from us. So you can see how they build this narrative, like using half-truths and absolute lies. The absolute lie is being all of these mansions and houses and cars that don't exist, there are any records of their existence or the link to the Venezuelan government. And on the other side, they use these assets that they have stolen from the Venezuelan people, from the Venezuelan state, and they try to portray it as something that they confiscated in the name of this anti-narcotic operation that they are using.
You know, when I saw that, the first thing that came to mind was that Forbes article that claimed that Fidel Castro was at one point personally worth $900 million. And of course, there's no truth to that allegation. It was a fabrication from the get-go, trying to claim that Cuban state assets were somehow the personal assets of Castro. It was a really far-fetched accusation, but a lot of people believed it, as in a lot of people have also believed this narrative coming from Pam Bondi. It was really interesting as well, like the really weird production values, the kind of really dim set. It was obviously an intelligence operation to try to propagandize the US public. And then one of the things that I've been saying consistently about this is that if anybody believes this, all it does is prove that the United States is the most propagandized country on the planet, who are willing or are liable to falling victim to these kinds of lies. It really is laughable. But of course, the danger isn't, right? All of this is playing towards mobilizing sentiment inside the United States if and when there is military action against us. I have here up on the screen, U.S. threatens Venezuela with Southern Caribbean sea troop deployment, a piece that you wrote very recently. I wanted you to help us understand how serious this is. You know, we've heard the number 4,000 floating around. How much of a danger is there really that this could turn into an actual military misadventure in Latin America by the United States again?
Yes, so we saw this whole narco-state narrative, and we were wondering what is behind this whole thing. And then we saw the announcement by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. He confirmed on August 14 that the U.S. was sending 4,000 troops to the Caribbean Sea. And then later on, we found out that the U.S. was also going to allocate several military assets to the U.S. Southern Command, some warships, some destroyers, and, well, the whole war machinery that you can imagine is being allocated to the U.S. Southern Command. So, I mean, I'm not sure how to interpret this whole thing. I think that the threat is real. I think the U.S. military threat is absolutely real. But I also think that they are sort of trying to create like a psychological terror campaign against Venezuela. You know, I don't know if you saw, there was an article by Reuters in which they claimed that there were 3 warships already coming to Venezuela and that they were going to arrive in 36 hours. And then this was disproven by other media outlets saying that no, there are currently no warships going to Venezuela, but they will be. They will be allocated. 3 warships are going to be allocated to the U.S. Southern Command. Are going to be deployed in the next several months. And I don't think these conflicting reports, I don't think they are a mistake. I think this is happening on purpose. They're trying to create this psychological terror against the Venezuelan people. They're trying to destabilize the entire Caribbean region. I also believe that the primary goal of the U.S. with this military threat and this bounty on Maduro, I think the primary goal is to incite mercenary incursions in Venezuela. I think it is to incite more terrorist attacks in Venezuela from far-right groups or far-right organizations. I think that's the goal. I think they're trying to sort of create the scenario so these terrorist violent plots against Venezuela can happen. The way I think about it is that they're trying to create a perfect scenario for President Maduro to be assassinated and for the Venezuelan government to be overthrown without the U.S. having to do much about it. And I think that's the primary goal of this whole thing. Of course, I do believe that the threat of an actual invasion is real. It can happen. I don't know if you heard that he met with Zelensky. And Zelensky was explaining to him that you cannot have elections during war, and that's why Ukraine hasn't had an election. And then Trump was like, "Oh, so maybe I'll just start a war so I can stay in power for a lot more." And I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I do think that a lot of the decisions that the Trump administration makes are more in line with staying in power, with finding a way to stay in power. So I don't discard the threat of an invasion of Venezuela for the sole purpose that I think Trump will try to use that as a way to stay longer in power. Of course, I mean, one thing that I keep thinking is something that is going to deter the U.S. from actually committing a military invasion. I think it will be the response of Latin America, of the Caribbean. I think, and I have to trust that Latin America and the Caribbean, that all of our neighbors are going to stand very firmly and are going to reject any invasion of Venezuela. They're going to reject any military operation, even the whole thing of surrounding Venezuela. I think I have to trust that that's going to happen, because in times like this, I was thinking just this morning, I woke up and I was like, what can we do? I mean, if an actual military threat comes to fruition, if we wake up one day and we are told that we're being invaded, what can we do? It is such a weird thing to imagine, you know? And I kept thinking, there's nothing really we can do. At the end of the day, we really have to trust that that the countries that are our neighbors, that the countries that are Venezuelan allies are going to be really, really strong in rejecting any invasion of Venezuela. We have to trust that our leaders are truly making everything possible to create precaution. We saw that Maduro was deploying like 4 million militia members. This is a people's militia. This is a militia that was created for all men and women of all ages to get involved and to be able to help with security. So there's precaution being taken place, but at the same time, because of he's mobilizing the militia, you sort of realize that he's also prioritizing the idea of not succumbing to desperation, to just create this idea that, okay, we are protecting the nation, but we're also prioritizing peace. We're also calling that the most important thing that we need to do is to call for peace, to call for respect Venezuela's sovereignty, and to try to get the whole Latin American region to unite in this moment and protect the Venezuelan people. And yeah, I mean, I think that's the one thing that I think we have to do. Just we have to rely on international solidarity in these moments.
And of course, we've also seen a really important mobilization inside of Venezuela. You mentioned the militia, but also ordinary Venezuelans who have responded to the call to show their rejection of this kind of language, of this saber rattling, this ramping up of tensions in the region as a result of U.S. declarations. We saw this really important, anti-imperialist explicit march in the streets of Caracas recently. We have here up on the screen this article you wrote about that as well. So I think part of this is, of course, never forget that we're talking about a population that has lived the revolutionary process, is engaged in that kind of a transformation, has a heightened political consciousness, and of course has endured decades now of US aggression. And it's not something that's particularly unfamiliar. One of the things that I think does set things apart in terms of the Trump administration versus previous US aggressions in the region from other presidents has been precisely the domestic agenda. And I agree with your hypothesis that a lot of this probably responds to domestic considerations. Trump wanting to, one, continue to insist that there is an emergency on the border, which allows him a lot of room to operate when it comes to tariff policy, for example, something that he is very interested in and wouldn't be able to do if it wasn't for this so-called emergency that is part of the narrative, the Venezuelan migrants and Tren de Agua and on all of the drugs that are quote unquote flooding into the country. But I think also just how unpredictable Trump can be. Certainly here in Mexico, where I'm based, one of the things that we've been paying a lot of attention to is just how serious they are about unilateral military action against the so-called terrorist transnational organizations. It definitely seems from my perspective that the hawks, the sort of the more aggressive elements of the White House under Trump right now, have won the day. They are very much the ones calling the shots now. And, we saw a report from Rolling Stone not too long ago, quoting anonymous sources, saying that they're serious about this, that they are going to engage in unilateral military action inside Mexico. And if they're willing to do it in Mexico, their number one trading partner, their neighbor, very important player in the global economy, then of course they're also willing to do it to Venezuela to try to destabilize. And I wanted to follow up with that hypothesis of yours that you think that a lot of this is kind of a destabilizing effort to try to make it more possible for other actors or for more covert action to be successful. I found it really worrisome, not that he's a serious, person and that his ideas have any validity, but the fact that somebody like Alex Jones is openly talking about military intervention in Venezuela by the United States, I think is worrisome because he represents a certain segment of that right-wing populist base that is so important to Trump. And so the fact that he's talking about it, despite, at times posturing as somebody who's against it, I believe the language he specifically uses, they started it. So this isn't offensive, this is defensive, right? And I think that does work to convince a lot of gullible people inside the United States. So if and when there is a destabilizing action, like an assassination attempt, God forbid a successful one against Maduro, that the population will swallow it and will support, whatever kind of emergency moves that they'll take. It's dangerous to try to predict, but should there be a destabilizing event inside Venezuela, that's where you would see, the OAS jump in, or even the UN Security Council calling for an emergency mobilization of international force to provide security inside Venezuela, because of course it would lead to a very dangerous situation on the ground. I think not a month goes by that we don't see Diosdado Cabello, the Interior Minister, denouncing yet another plot of assassination of high-ranking figures in the government or Maduro himself. And so I do think that we have to, given what we've seen from Trump, what his intentions are, the place that all of this plays in the domestic agenda, consider that there is a very serious threat here. And of course, I think, like you said, I think the international response has to play a critical role. Trump is losing allies in the region. I think he has, his Noboas and his Bukeles and his Malays here that he can probably count on. And that they would probably cheerlead any kind of military misadventure by the United States in Latin America. But there's also Lula, Petro, Sheinbaum, which also play a very important role. And also considering that they are much larger, more significant economies, I think means that they're their denunciation, I think, would, carry a heavier weight and would be more important. So before we conclude here, I wanted to hear your thoughts in terms of how things are inside Venezuela, the mood of the population in terms of this. Is there an unease in the country, and do you think the population will respond the way that we expect them to if there really is a destabilizing action?
So basically, people right now they're okay. They're going on with their daily lives. They are aware of the situation. People are incredibly aware always of what is happening with Venezuela. They know about the military threats. They know about the narco-state narrative. But people are, as I was saying before, in situations like this is when you realize there's really nothing much you can do at the time. When you are facing a threat, you're just sort of like in this moment in which you are, okay, so this is happening, but you also, there's nothing immediate that you can do as a civilian. So people are just aware of the situation, but going on with their daily lives. But I do believe that in the event of a military threat to actually consolidate against Venezuela, if we actually are facing something like that, I am 100% certain that people are going to respond tremendously well, and they're going to respond completely united. This is something that we have been working on for 25 years, the unity in the face of these external threats. When U.S. sanctions happened against Venezuela back in 2017, 2019, 2020, one of the things that kept the Venezuelan population alive was the fact that we really became a truly united solidarity network of neighbors and people. And that's what kept us alive. That's the time when, as you well know, that's also the time when the communes became stronger and they grew and they became more organized. And so in the face of aggression, the Venezuelan people has always known that united and facing these things united and organizing themselves is going to be the way to survive. And I don't have any doubt that that's going to happen again. I do believe that at the end of the day, like you said, this is all going to boil down to what is the international response. And I think that we've already heard Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, saying that invading Venezuela will be basically turning Venezuela into another Syria. It will mean destabilizing the entire region. Millions of Venezuelans will probably have to flee the country. And of course, as we all know, and Petro specified, we all know that the primary goal of all of this is to steal Venezuela's oil reserves. We know that Venezuela is the number one country in the world with the majority of the proven oil reserves. So we know that we are an oil country, and we know that the United States wants the oil. And so Petro is right when he says that we all know that that's the primary goal. But on top of that, I also believe that even though the U.S., of course, wants to steal our resources, I also think that we are just a threat because of who we are. The Venezuelan people has declared itself to be anti-imperialist. It has declared itself to be on the communal path. It has declared itself to be to continue to promote regional integration. And I think we're also just a threat because of who we are, because we have survived 25 years, despite the fact that we have been facing U.S. sanctions, despite the fact that we have been facing several terrorist plots, despite the fact that we even had a fake president for a few years. They have thrown absolutely everything they can think of against us, and we have survived, and we continue to move forward with this Bolivarian project, this socialist initiative. And I think also one of the primary goals of this whole U.S. aggression is trying to destabilize Venezuela to the point that they can overthrow their government, and to the point that the Bolivarian project disappears. And I think that's also, it is on par with stealing oil resource. They need the oil, but they also need for the anti-imperialist threat to go away, especially now when the U.S. has become such an exposed government and entity. Since the Gaza genocide, we have seeing that more and more people around the world have seen the United States for what it is, which is a liar, capital-driven, bloodthirsty, Zionist entity that is willing to support and finance and arm a Zionist organization and genocide an entire peoples just so they can continue to advance in their own foreign policy goals. So I also think that Venezuela has played and will continue to play a really important role in exposing the U.S. And I think that's also what makes us a threat to the U.S. And that's why I think that for sure, we're going to continue facing more. Even if it's not an invasion, we're going to continue to face a lot more aggressions against our people.
And I think it's important to make a call to the population inside the United States as well, to precisely remind them, as you have, that a government that backs a genocide against the Palestinian people is not a government that has a correct moral compass, that is actually interested in the welfare of the population. They may claim that they're interested in defending Venezuela and Venezuelan population, but we know what their intentions are. As you have correctly said, on the one hand, it is about destabilizing a government that is incredibly uncomfortable, that has been stalwart in its defense of its sovereignty in the face of continued endless aggression by the series of US governments, be they Democratic or Republican, but also the resources. I think you're absolutely right. And I'm glad that you also mentioned Petro's comments around how this would lead to a Syria-like situation, which is absolutely correct. You know, that this would be catastrophic, not just for Venezuela, but for the entire region. And the fallout would be really, really difficult. And so to the United States residents and citizens right now, you know, if some kind of action does come to pass, I hope that we'll see an important mobilization by the population to say no, because this is not something that we actually want to allow them to get away with. It would be incredibly harmful to the entire region, but to the US people themselves as well. You know, it would, I think, possibly set the stage for further undemocratic actions inside the United States. You know, not too long ago, we were talking about, you know, Fannon's boomerang, about how colonial violence eventually makes its way back home. We're already seeing that. US militarized policy in the region has now kind of replicated itself on the border between the United States and Mexico. And we're also seeing troops on the streets of the United States Capitol, you know, acting like thugs, grabbing and arresting whoever they feel, acting with impunity. And if you let them get away with regime change in the world, what makes you think that they're not willing to push that same boundary against your own friends and neighbors? They're already kidnapping them, sending them off to gulags in El Salvador or camps that are uninhabitable in Guantanamo Bay. So I do think that there is a very important lesson for the US population in all of this as well. You know, obviously, as I said earlier, they've been subjected to massive amounts of propaganda when it comes to Venezuela. A lot of them probably have a very negative view of Nicolás Maduro in particular. But I would hope that they would be able to push past that and be able to understand what's actually happening here, especially given, as you said, what's happening in the world. Never has it been more obvious what the true face of US imperialism actually is. And before we say goodbye, I wanted to bring up a couple of articles here we have on the website that that get into the details of this. We have this analysis from our columnist Clodovalio Hernandez, the cartel of the suns, leftovers that were never edible. The U.S. is recycling debunked claims about Maduro and Venezuelan officials being connected to narco-terrorism. It's an excellent breakdown of just how outlandish all of this really is. I particularly like this graphic that we made for it, showing Mr. Burns unable to eat his own radioactive fish, and I think it captures it well. But I also wanted to share this one here from Michelle Elner, a friend of Venezuelanalysis, Trump's Venezuela drug war gambit and the militarization playbook at home. Solidarity activist Michelle Elner takes stock of the Trump administration's escalating rhetoric, militarization, and migrant crackdown, where she connects a lot of those dots that I was just talking about. The foreign agenda and the domestic agenda are actually not all that different. And in fact, there's actually a lot of interplay between them, which is dangerous for the peoples of Latin America, who simply want to be free and pursue their own sovereign project, and also the peoples of the United States, which are now facing a very authoritarian, aggressive government in Washington.
For sure. I do recommend people to read the Clodovaldo Hernandez article because he does explain very well what are the origins of Cartel de los Soles and how this narrative has grown. And he also points out something that everybody should know, that Hugo Chavez was also accused of leading every single criminal organization that existed in the world back then. So this isn't new. It's not like, oh, this is just for Maduro because Maduro is really bad. No. Hugo Chavez was accused of practically the same things. So this is something that is the same reheated narrative being revived every few years when it's convenient for the United States. And there's a quote by Clodovaldo Hernandez that I wrote down because I thought it was important. He says in the column, the purpose has always been the same in Venezuela as elsewhere with leftist or socially oriented governments, to criminalize popular movements and demonize their leaders. So this was true when Hugo Chavez was president. This is true now that Maduro is president, and it's going to continue to be true as long as Venezuela has a socialist-oriented government.
And just the other day, we came across this video of Hugo Chavez basically saying the same thing. They will say whatever they think will work in order to convince the population that something untoward is happening in Venezuela and something must be done. But fortunately, we have Venezuelanalysis, we have your viewpoints. This conversation has been excellent about unpacking all of that and getting to the root of these threats by the United States against Venezuela, how serious it really is. Again, I think it's important for us to maintain a state of alertness when it comes to this, because Trump really is, in a lot of ways, unpredictable, and I think would be liable to do just about anything if it meant advancing his own agenda and his own priorities. Thanks so much for joining us, Andreína. And before we go, I want to give you a chance to say some parting words.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And as I said before, I think that the one thing that everybody can do right now is the same thing we have been doing for Gaza and for Palestine. We need to go to the streets, we need to rally, we need to show solidarity, we need to show the US government that the people are not so propagandized anymore as they thought they were.
Abajo el imperialismo. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you on the next episode of the Venezuelanalysis podcast.